The champagne in his hand was vintage, a celebration of the partnership that was supposed to secure their future. But the moans echoing from the master bedroom told a different story. It wasn't the betrayal that broke him. It was the familiarity of the voices, the realization that his wife and his mentor were laughing at the very naivety he had worn like a badge of honor. He didn't scream. He didn't kick down the door. He simply set the bottle on the marble console and walked out into the rain, leaving his old life to rot behind the heavy oak door. If you find yourself drawn to stories where the silence hurts more than the shouting, and where revenge is a dish served cold over a decade, stay with me, because the real storm is just beginning. The rain in New York didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker. Ethan Vance paid the cab driver and stepped out onto the sidewalk of Cobble Hill, shielding the leather portfolio against his chest. Inside was the signed contract for the Hudson Yards Annex. Wow, Ballmine Annex, the deal that would finally let him buy out the mortgage on the brownstone. He was 32, tired, and deliriously happy. He checked his watch. Clara wouldn't expect him back from Chicago until midnight. He let himself into the vestibule, shaking off his umbrella. The house was quiet, smelling faintly of the lilies Clara insisted on keeping in the foyer, despite his mild allergies. He smiled at the thought. It was a compromise, like the modern art she hung over his vintage drafting table. Marriage was a series of small surrenders, he told himself, and he was happy to yield. "Clara," he called out, his voice soft, expecting her to be in the garden or perhaps napping. No answer. He walked past the living room. Her purse, the Chanel tote he'd bought her for their anniversary, was spilled onto the rug. A man's trench coat was draped over the banister. Ethan paused. It was a cashmere coat, charcoal gray. He knew that coat. He had complimented Julian on it 3 days ago at the firm's partner lunch. Julian must have stopped by to drop off the revised blueprints, Ethan thought. His mind, trained to find structural logic, immediately built a scaffolding of reasonable explanations. He started up the stairs. The wood, usually creaky, seemed to absorb his footsteps today. As he reached the landing, the sound reached him. It wasn't a conversation. It was a low, throaty laugh. Clara's laugh, the one she used after 3 glasses of wine, the one that used to be reserved for him. Then a man's voice, deep and resonant. "He's too rigid, Clara. He thinks in grids. You need flow." "I know," Clara's voice purred, muffled, likely by skin or fabric. "God, I know. He's so boring, Julian. But he's safe." Ethan stopped. The door to the master bedroom was just an inch. He shouldn't look. The moral human part of him knew that looking would irrevocably shatter the world as he understood it. If he turned around now, he could pretend he heard nothing. He could go back to the airport, wait 6 hours, and come home to a lie that felt like a life. But he was an architect. He needed to see the flaws in the foundation. He pushed the door. It swung silently on well-oiled hinges. The afternoon light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a haze over the bed. They hadn't even bothered to close the blinds fully. Clara was arched back, her eyes closed in a parody of ecstasy, her hands gripping the sheets. And there was Julian, his mentor, his best friend, the man who had toasted at their wedding, looming over her, claiming what was supposed to be sacred. Ethan felt a physical blow to his chest, sharp and cold, as if a steel beam had swung into his ribs. The portfolio slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The noise acted like a gunshot. Clara's eyes snapped open. She saw him. The scream died in her throat. She froze, her face cycling through confusion, terror, and finally, a devastating naked shame. Julian scrambled, pulling the duvet up, looking ridiculous and small despite his power. "Ethan," Julian stammered, his voice cracking. "Ethan, wait, let's discuss this." Discuss, as if this were a zoning dispute, as if this were a variance in the code. Ethan looked at his wife. He waited for her to say something, an apology, a lie, anything. But she just stared at him, and in her eyes, he saw the truth she had spoken moments ago. He's safe, he's boring. He realized then that he wasn't looking at his wife. He was looking at a stranger who had been squatting in his home, wearing his wife's face. The rage didn't come. Instead, a terrifying clarity washed over him. The house, the lilies, the mortgage, the promotion. It was all structurally unsound. It was condemned. "Ethan, please," Clara whispered, reaching out a hand. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't step forward. He looked at them for 3 seconds, long enough to burn the image into his retina forever. And then he turned around. "Ethan!" Clara shrieked now, the sound tearing through the house. He walked down the stairs. He didn't run. He walked with the steady, measured pace of a man inspecting a site one last time before demolition. In the foyer, he saw his reflection in the antique mirror. He looked pale, like a ghost. He took the house keys off his ring and placed them gently on the console table, next to the vase of lilies. He placed his wedding band beside them. It made a small clink against the wood. He picked up the umbrella. He opened the front door. "Ethan, stop! Where are you going?" Julian's voice boomed from the top of the stairs, trying to regain authority. Ethan stepped out into the rain. He hailed a cab that was just turning the corner. "JFK," he told the driver. "International Terminal." "You got luggage, buddy?" the driver asked, looking at Ethan's empty hands. Ethan looked back at the brownstone one last time. He saw the curtain twitch in the upstairs window. "No," Ethan said, turning forward, his eyes dry and burning. "I don't have anything." London was not a refuge. It was a purgatory of gray skies and damp wool. 6 months after leaving New York, Ethan sat in a cramped studio apartment in Hackney that smelled of mildew and stale tea. The window overlooked a recycling plant, the constant grinding of glass and metal providing the only soundtrack to his days. He had grown a beard, not out of style but out of apathy. His bank account, once padded with the bonuses of a rising associate, was now dwindling to dangerous double digits. He had walked away from everything. The joint accounts, the investments, the 401k. He hadn't touched a cent of the money that was tied to Clara. He would rather starve than use a dollar that had her name on it. On the desk in front of him lay a stack of cheap sketch paper. For weeks he had tried to draw, but his hand refused to make the graceful, organic curves that had been his signature at the firm. The flow that Julian had mocked. Every time he tried to draw an arch, he saw Clara's back arching. Every time he tried to design a light-filled atrium, he saw the afternoon sun filtering through the bedroom curtains. Light was a lie. It revealed things you didn't want to see. He crumpled the paper and threw it onto the floor, adding to the mountain of white trash. "Mr. Vance," the landlady knocked on the door. "Rent's due on Tuesday, love. Don't make me chase you." "I know," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "You'll have it." He didn't know how. He was working cash-in-hand shifts at a demolition site, hauling rubble. It was fitting work. He was good at clearing away debris. That afternoon, sheltering from a freezing drizzle under the brutal overhang of the National Theater on the South Bank, something shifted. He looked up at the rough, board-marked concrete. Most people found it ugly, oppressive, heavy, unforgiving. But for the first time, Ethan saw the honesty in it. Concrete didn't pretend to be marble. It didn't hide its weight. It was defensive. It was a fortress. It kept the world out and the silence in. He pulled a damp notebook from his pocket. He didn't draw a sweeping curve. He drew a hard vertical line. Then another. Thick, imposing walls. Narrow windows that looked like arrow slits. A structure that said, "Do not enter. Do not touch." He drew for hours until his fingers were numb. When he looked down, he realized he wasn't designing a home. He was designing a bunker for a soul. The next day, he walked into a small, avant-garde architectural collective in Shoreditch. He didn't show them his portfolio from New York, the accolades, the glass towers. He showed them the notebook from the rain. The creative director, a pierced woman with eyes like flint, looked at the sketches. "This is angry," she said. "It's hostile." "It's safe," Ethan corrected. "What's your name?" He hesitated. Ethan Vance was the man who bought lilies for a wife who cheated on him. Ethan Vance was the man who believed in compromise. Ethan Vance was dead. He had died in a brownstone in Cobble Hill. Blackwood, he said. The name came from nowhere, or perhaps from the dark, charred remains of his past. Evie Blackwood. She hired him on the spot as a junior drafter. It was a humiliating step down for a man who had once spearheaded multi-million-dollar projects. But Evie Blackwood didn't have an ego. He had a purpose. Over the next 2 years, the transformation solidified. He stopped smiling. He stopped socializing. He worked 16-hour days, channeling every ounce of his grief and rage into his designs. His buildings were monoliths of shadow and stone, celebrated by critics for their uncompromising nihilism. He legally changed his name. He learned German because the syntax was rigid, logical, devoid of ambiguity. He started wearing bespoke suits, not for vanity, but as armor, sharp tailoring that held him together when he felt like falling apart. One evening, alone in his now spacious, minimalist apartment in Zurich, he received a forwarded letter from a lawyer in New York. It was divorce papers. He didn't open the envelope. He didn't need to read Clara's excuses or her demands. He simply struck a match and held it to the corner of the paper. He watched the flame consume his old name, the fire reflecting in his eyes that had once been warm hazel, now looking like polished flint. He dropped the burning ash into a concrete bowl on his table. "Goodbye, Ethan," he whispered into the empty, silent room. E.V. Blackwood stood up, straightened his tie, and went back to the drafting table. He had an empire to build, and this time there would be no doors left unlocked. 10 years later, silence was the most expensive commodity in the world, and E.V. Blackwood owned a great deal of it. His office in Zurich was a testament to his reputation. Perched above the Limit River, the walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, yet the interior felt like a cathedral. There were no photographs on the desk, no clutter, no personal artifacts, just a sleek black granite surface that looked more like an altar than a workspace. He stood by the window, watching the snow fall on the distant Alps. At 42, he was leaner than the man who had left New York. His hair was kept meticulously short, salted with premature gray at the temples. The soft lines of his face had hardened into angles that matched his architecture. "Herr Blackwood." He turned slowly. His assistant, Frau Heller, stood in the doorway. She had worked for him for 5 years and still hesitated before entering, as if expecting the room to depressurize. "The courier arrived from New York," she said, placing a thick, velvet-bound portfolio on his desk. "It is the proposal from the Thorn Preservation Trust." Thorn. The name landed in the quiet room like a stone dropped in a well. It didn't ripple. Ethan had spent a decade freezing the water, so nothing could ripple ever again. He walked to the desk. His movements were precise, economical. He opened the portfolio. Inside were photographs of the Vanderhoven Library, a Beaux-Arts masterpiece on Fifth Avenue that had been rotting for years. He saw the crumbling limestone, the water-damaged frescoes, the desperate need for structural reinforcement. It was a dying building, and then he saw the cover letter. To E.V. Blackwood and Associates, "We are in search of a visionary who understands that preservation is not just about keeping the past, but surviving it." The stationery was cream-colored, heavy stock. The signature at the bottom was elegant, looping, and painfully familiar. Clara Thorne, Director of Preservation. She had kept the name. She had taken Julian's name. Ethan stared at the ink. He didn't feel the sharp stab of betrayal he had felt in the hallway in Cobble Hill. That nerve had been severed long ago. Instead, he felt a cold, clinical curiosity. The letter was desperate. The financials attached to the back were even worse. The trust was bleeding money. This project was a Hail Mary, a final attempt to save the family legacy from bankruptcy. They needed a savior. They had written to the most expensive, exclusive architect in Europe, likely expecting a rejection. "Shall I draft the standard refusal?" Frau Heller asked, noting his silence. "You do not typically accept restoration work. You prefer to build from the ground up." "No," Ethan said. His voice was smooth, a low baritone that revealed nothing. "Book the jet. We go to New York." "New York? Immediately?" "Immediately." He closed the portfolio. He wasn't going back to save a library. He was going back because the structure of his past was finally ready for demolition, and he wanted to be the one to swing the hammer. The flight was uneventful. He spent the 8 hours reviewing the schematics of the library, finding every weakness, every load-bearing column that was close to failure. It was a mess of neglect and mismanagement. It was perfect. When the plane began its descent over Manhattan, the city glittered below him like a circuit board. 10 years ago, he had looked down at this island with tears in his eyes, feeling small and expelled. Now, as the landing gear deployed with a mechanical thud, he felt nothing but control. He didn't go to Cobble Hill. He didn't look up his old friends. He checked into the penthouse of a hotel overlooking Central Park, a tower of steel and glass that looked down on the rest of the city. Standing on the balcony, the wind whipping his coat, E.V. Blackwood looked south, toward the unseen streets where Ethan Vance used to live. "I'm here," he said to the wind. He took out his phone and dialed the number on the letterhead. It was 10 o'clock p.m. in New York. A rude time to call, a power move. "Thorn Preservation Trust," a tired female voice answered. It wasn't Clara. It was a secretary working too late. "This is E.V. Blackwood's office," he said, disguising his voice with the faintest hint of a German inflection he had picked up over the years. "Mr. Blackwood has arrived in the city. He will see Mrs. Thorn tomorrow at the gala. Do not be late." He hung up before she could respond. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the balcony door. The man staring back was a stranger. Good. That was exactly what he needed to be. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel smelled of expensive desperation, a potent mix of gardenias, truffle oil, and old money terrified of becoming new poverty. E.V. Blackwood stood in the shadow of a Corinthian column, nursing a glass of sparkling water he had no intention of drinking. He wore a tuxedo cut so precisely it looked like a weapon, the black velvet absorbing the room's light. He had been there for 20 minutes unnoticed. That was the trick of his new persona. He was a void in the room, a gravitational pull that people sensed but couldn't quite see. From his vantage point, he watched them. Clara stood near the ice sculpture, accepting a donation check from a senator. 10 years had sharpened her. The soft, rounded girl he had married was gone. This woman was angular, her collarbones prominent above the emerald neckline of her gown. She was smiling, but Ethan recognized the tension in her jaw, the same tension she used to get when the bills piled up. She looked exhausted, her makeup applied with a heavy hand to conceal the dark circles of sleepless nights. And then there was Julian. The man who had once been the golden boy of Manhattan architecture was now ruddy-faced and loud. He stood by the bar, gesturing too broadly with a scotch in his hand, laughing at a joke no one else seemed to find funny. His hair was thinning, combed carefully to hide the scalp, and his suit, while expensive, strained at the buttons. He looked like a man who had spent a decade running on a treadmill of his own ego and was finally losing his breath. "Mrs. Thorn," a donor said loudly, "we hear you've secured a miracle for the library project." Clara's smile wavered. "We are hopeful. The architect is very selective." "Selective is an understatement," Ethan said, stepping out of the shadows. The conversation in the immediate vicinity died. The crowd parted instinctively for him, sensing the sudden drop in temperature. Clara turned. The glass in her hand trembled slightly, the liquid splashing against the rim. She looked up at him, her eyes widening. "Mr. Blackwood?" she asked. Her voice was breathy, uncertain. "Mrs. Thorn," Ethan replied. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply stood there, 6'2" of indifferent judgment. "My office confirmed my attendance." "Yes," she stammered, recovering her poise with practiced ease. "Yes, of course, we just didn't expect you to be so young." She was scanning his face. Ethan held her gaze. He didn't blink. He waited for the spark of recognition, the sudden intake of breath that would signal the end of the game. Her brow furrowed. She tilted her head slightly to the left, a habit she had when she was puzzled. "Have we met before, Mr. Blackwood?" "I don't believe so," Ethan said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth Ethan Vance used to have. "I have spent the last decade in Zurich. I rarely leave my work." "You seem familiar," she whispered, more to herself than him. "Perhaps I simply have one of those faces," he said dryly. "Or perhaps you are confusing me with somebody who cared about social pleasantries." Clara flushed. The insult was subtle, but it landed. "Darling!" Julian's voice boomed as he pushed through the circle, smelling of scotch and expensive cologne. He slid an arm around Clara's waist, a possessive, heavy gesture that made her stiffen imperceptibly. "Is this the genius? The hermit of the Alps?" Ethan shifted his gaze to Julian. Up close, the damage was even more apparent. The whites of Julian's eyes were yellowed. The veins in his nose were broken. "Julian Thorn," Julian said, extending a hand. "Senior partner. Thorn and Associates." Ethan looked at the hand. It was the hand that had signed his first paycheck, the hand that had poured his champagne, the hand that had been on his wife's skin. Ethan raised his own hand slowly. He gripped Julian's fingers not with a shake but with a squeeze, just hard enough to grind the knuckles together. "Blackwood," Ethan said, "I've reviewed your firm's previous work on the library. It was adequate for the era." Julian's smile faltered. "Adequate? We won the Pritzk." "I am not interested in your trophies, Mr. Thorne," Ethan cut him off, releasing his hand abruptly. "I am interested in structure, and from what I see, your structure is failing." He wasn't talking about the building. Julian bristled, his face reddening, but Clara intervened, placing a hand on his chest. "Mr. Blackwood is a perfectionist, Julian. That is why we need him." She turned to Ethan, her eyes pleading, "Please ignore my husband. He is passionate. We are desperate for your vision." My husband. The words should have hurt. Instead, they felt like a diagnosis. "We will see if my vision can survive your reality," Ethan said. He checked his watch, a Patek Philippe that cost more than the annual salary of a junior architect. "I will meet you at the site tomorrow at 7 o'clock a.m. sharp. Bring the blueprints. And Mrs. Thorne?" "Yes?" "Do not wear heels," he said, turning to walk away. "The foundation is unstable. You wouldn't want to fall." He walked toward the exit, feeling their eyes boring into his back. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what they looked like. Two people standing in the ruins of a life they thought they had built, unaware that the demolition crew had just arrived. The Vanderhoven Library was a cavern of dust and freezing air. At 7 o'clock a.m., the morning light filtered through the dirty, arched windows and gray beams, illuminating the particles dancing in the silence. It was dead silent, save for the rhythmic tapping of a cane against the marble floor. Ethan didn't need a cane, but he carried one, black mahogany with a silver handle. It was an affectation, a tool to point, to prod, and to create distance. He stood in the center of the great hall, looking up at the peeling fresco on the ceiling. "Mr. Blackwood?" Clara's voice echoed in the vast space. She was walking toward him from the entrance, flanked by two nervous junior architects holding rolls of blueprints. She was wearing flat boots and a heavy wool coat, her breath pluming in the cold air. Ethan didn't turn around immediately. He let her wait for 3 seconds, a beat of silence that established who controlled the time in this room. "You are 4 minutes late," he said to the ceiling. "Traffic on the FDR was..." "Irrelevant," he cut in, turning sharply. He pointed the cane at the nearest pillar. "This limestone is porous. The water damage is not superficial. It is systemic. Your husband's firm proposed filling it with epoxy resin." Clara nodded eagerly, pulling a file from her bag. "Yes, it's a cost-effective solution. It preserves the aesthetic while stabilizing the..." "It is a lie," Ethan said softly. He walked over to the pillar and struck it with the handle of his cane. A flake of stone crumbled and fell to the floor. "Epoxy is a bandage. It hides the rot. It does not cure it," Ethan said, staring at her. "I do not build on lies, Mrs. Thorne, and I certainly do not restore them." Clara bit her lip. She looked tired, her face pale without the gala makeup. "Mr. Blackwood, the trust has a budget. We cannot replace all the structural columns. That would cost millions." "Then you do not have a library," Ethan said, shrugging. "You have a tomb." He walked past her, toward the main staircase. "Rip out the flooring, all of it. I want to see the joists." "The flooring is original 1920s marble," one of the junior architects protested. Ethan stopped and looked at the young man. The boy withered instantly. "The joists are rotting," Ethan said. "If you put people on this floor, they will fall through. Perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but eventually, gravity collects its debt." He turned back to Clara. She was wringing her hands. A nervous tic, he remembered. She used to do that when he worked late, worrying about whether the roast would dry out. "Tear it up," Clara ordered the junior architect, her voice tight. "Do as he says." "But the cost..." "Do it," she snapped. Ethan watched her unravel. It was fascinating, like watching a bridge vibrate in high wind. He walked closer to her, invading her personal space just enough to be unsettling. He smelled her perfume, Chanel No. 5. It was the same scent she had worn for 10 years. It made his stomach turn, but his face remained a mask of indifference. You are worried about the money, Ethan stated. The trust is stretched, Clara admitted, lowering her voice so her staff couldn't hear. Julian made some aggressive investments that didn't punt out. We need this restoration to be the flagship that brings donors back. If the budget balloons, the board will pull the plug. So you want me to compromise, Ethan said. I want you to be reasonable. Ethan laughed, a short, sharp sound that had no humor in it. He leaned in, his eyes locking onto hers. Reasonable is for people who are afraid of the dark, Mrs. Thorne. You hired me because I am not. He paused, letting the silence stretch again. I remember a saying, perhaps you know it. Life is a series of small surrenders. Clara froze. Her eyes widened, the pupils blowing wide in the dim light. She took a half step back, her breath hitching. That was what she had told him the night he proposed. Marriage is just a series of small surrenders, Ethan. You give a little, I give a little. Where did you hear that? She whispered. It is a common enough sentiment among the weak, Ethan said coldly, straightening up. But I do not surrender, and neither does this building. You will replace the limestone with Italian travertine. You will reinforce the joists with steel, not timber, and you will find the money. Mr. Blackwood, please, Clara begged, her voice cracking. I can't authorize that kind of spending without Julian's signature, and he will never— Then get a new signature, Ethan said, turning his back on her. Or get a new architect. He walked away, the tap, tap, tap of his cane echoing like a countdown. He knew she would find the money, she would sell her jewelry, she would leverage the house. She would bleed herself dry to keep him. Because he wasn't just offering a building anymore. He was offering her a penance she didn't even know she was seeking. 2 weeks later, the library had been stripped to its skeleton. The temporary office, set up in what used to be the reading room, was a chaotic landscape of blueprints, takeout coffee cups, and invoices. It was 11 o'clock p.m. The construction crew had left hours ago. The only light came from the desk lamps, casting long, distorted shadows against the exposed brick walls. Ethan sat at the main drafting table, his back rigid. Across from him, Clara was drowning in paperwork. She had been on the phone for an hour, her voice dropping to a hushed, frantic whisper every time she glanced in his direction. I know, Julian. I know the credit line is maxed out. She hissed into her cell phone, hunched over as if to physically shield herself from the conversation. Just move the funds from the escrow. No, you can't touch that. Julian, please, I am at the site. I am working. Ethan didn't look up from his schematic, but he heard every word. He heard the slur in Julian's voice on the other end, the wet, heavy anger of a man who was drinking his own failure. Don't you dare hang up on me, Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Then silence. She lowered the phone slowly to the desk, her hand shaking so badly the device rattled against the wood. She put her head in her hands. Ethan continued to draw. He added a support beam to the west wing. He calculated the load. He waited. Is everything satisfactory, Mrs. Thorne? He asked finally, his tone devoid of empathy. Clara jerked her head up, startled. She quickly wiped under her eyes, smearing a trace of mascara. Yes, of course, just vendor issues. Lying to your architect is dangerous, Ethan said, still not looking at her. If I do not know the constraints, I cannot build the structure. It's personal, she said tightly. It doesn't concern the project. Everything concerns the project. He stood up and walked over to her desk. He looked down at the mess of papers. Hidden beneath the structural reports were other letters with red ink stamps. Past due. Final notice. Foreclosure warning. It wasn't just the trust, it was everything. The brownstone in Cobble Hill, his brownstone, was leveraged to the hilt. Julian hadn't just stagnated, he had hollowed out their life from the inside. Ethan felt a strange, cold sensation in his chest. He had come here to burn their house down, only to find they were already living in the ashes. He reached out and picked up a stack of disorganized invoices. You have always organized your chaos in piles of 3, he said quietly. Urgent, deferred, garbage. Why is this pile singular? Clara froze. The air in the room seemed to vanish. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, searching his face in the dim light. Excuse me? Ethan realized the slip immediately. It was a habit of hers from graduate school, one she had taught him when he was overwhelmed with coursework. 3 piles, Ethan. Only 3. He didn't retreat. He simply adjusted the mask. It is a standard organizational method, he said smoothly, dropping the papers back onto the desk. Inefficiency offends me. Sort them. Or I will have my assistant do it, and she will charge you 500 francs an hour. Clara didn't move. She was staring at his hands, his long, slender fingers that were currently resting on the edge of her desk. My husband, my ex-husband, she corrected herself, her voice barely a whisper. He had hands like yours. He had a scar, right there, from an X-Acto knife. Ethan looked at his left thumb. The faint white line was still there, faded by 10 years, but visible if you knew where to look. He covered it with his other hand, a movement so subtle it was almost invisible. We all bleed the same in this profession, Mrs. Thorne, he said coldly. Now go home. You are useless to me, exhausted. I can't go home, she blurted out. The confession hung between them. Wait, because he's there, she said, and the dam finally broke. A single tear tracked through the dust on her cheek. Because I fixed the accounts to pay for your Italian travertine, and when he finds out, he will not be happy. Ethan looked at the woman who had destroyed him. She was terrified, not of financial ruin, but of the man she had chosen over him. The safe choice. He should have felt triumph. This was the moment. The destruction was complete. He could fire her now, expose the embezzlement, and walk away. Instead, he felt a surge of something darker. A possessive, territorial rage. Not for her, but for the injustice of it. Julian had taken the prize and let it rot. Sleep here, Ethan said abruptly. He gestured to the leather sofa in the corner of the office. The security guard is downstairs. No one enters this site without my permission. Not even your husband. Clara looked at the sofa, then back at him. Why are you doing this? Because I need you lucid tomorrow to sign the checks, Ethan said, turning back to his drafting table. And because I do not like waste. He sat down and picked up his pen. He felt her eyes on his back, burning with questions she was too afraid to ask. He knew she was looking at the back of his neck, at the way his shoulders set when he worked. He was becoming a ghost in his own story, haunting the woman who had murdered him. Thank you, she whispered. Ethan didn't answer. He just drew a thick, black line across the page, severing the connection. The boardroom of the Thorne Preservation Trust was designed to intimidate. Dark mahogany paneling, oil paintings of stern ancestors, and a table long enough to land a small aircraft on. But on this Tuesday morning, the room felt more like a courtroom awaiting a verdict. Clara sat at the head of the table, flanked by 2 corporate lawyers who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. Opposite them sat Ethan. He was alone. He didn't need a legal team. He was the judge, jury, and executioner. Outside, a storm was battering the city, a heavy, relentless rain that reminded Ethan of the day he left. The situation is critical, Mr. Blackwood, the lead lawyer said, sliding a document across the polished wood. The cost overruns on the travertine and steel reinforcements have triggered a covenant clause with the bank. The trust is technically insolvent. Ethan didn't pick up the document. He just looked at it. Anne, Ethan asked, his voice calm. Anne, Clara interjected, her voice tight with panic. We need a guarantor. The bank is willing to extend the bridge loan, but only if the principal architect, you, signs as a co-surety. It's a formality, really, given your firm's liquidity. She trailed off. It wasn't a formality. It was a plea for rescue. She was asking him to use his own fortune to save her husband's legacy. You want me to underwrite your failure, Ethan stated. I want you to save the building, Clara cried out, abandoning the corporate veneer. You said you cared about structure, Mr. Blackwood. If you don't sign this, the project halts tomorrow. The building will be condemned. Everything we've done, it will all be for nothing. Ethan stood up. He walked to the window and watched the rain streak against the glass. The city looked blurred, impressionistic. For nothing, he repeated softly. Like a 10-year marriage ended in an afternoon. The room went silent. The lawyers exchanged confused glances. Clara stiffened. Mr. Blackwood, she whispered. Ethan turned. He walked slowly back to the table. He didn't sit. He leaned over, placing both hands flat on the mahogany surface looming over her. Do you know why I chose Italian travertine, Clara? He used her first name. No title, no Mrs. Thorne, just Clara. She blinked, disoriented. Because it's durable? Because it was the stone we saw in Rome, Ethan said. On our honeymoon, you touched the Colosseum and said you wanted to live in something that could serve an empire. Clara's face drained of blood. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The recognition hit her like a physical blow, not a slow realization, but a violent, sudden crash. The hands, the voice, the phrase about surrenders, the piles of three. Ethan, she breathed. The name was a ghost leaving her lips. The lawyers looked between them, sensing the sudden, catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. Mrs. Thorne, is there a— Leave us, Ethan commanded. He didn't look at the lawyers. He kept his eyes locked on Clara. But sir, the contracts— Get out, Ethan roared. The sound was terrifying, the first time in 10 years he had raised his voice. It cracked the veneer of Evie Blackwood and let the raw, jagged rage of Ethan Vance spill through. The lawyers scrambled, gathering their briefcases and fleeing the room. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing them in. Clara was trembling violently now. She pushed her chair back, as if trying to put distance between herself and the phantom she was seeing. It's not possible, she stammered. You left. You disappeared. They said you were— Dead, Ethan finished. I was. You killed me, Clara, in the master bedroom of our house. Do you remember? Ethan, please. She began to cry, ugly, gasping sobs. I was young. I was stupid. I didn't know what I was doing. You knew exactly what you were doing, Ethan said, his voice dropping back to that deadly, icy calm. I remember the sounds, Clara. I remember what you said. He's boring, but he's safe. He reached into his jacket pocket. He didn't pull out a pen to sign her loan. He pulled out a small velvet pouch. He upended it onto the table. A gold wedding band spun on the mahogany and settled with a final clatter. Clara stared at the ring. She reached out a shaking hand but didn't dare touch it. I have carried that for 3,650 days, Ethan said. Not because I loved you, but because I needed to remember the weight of a lie. I am so sorry, she sobbed, putting her head on the table. Ethan, look at me. Look at my life. I have paid for it. Julian he is a monster. I am drowning. I have nothing left. You have the house, Ethan reminded her. The bank is taking the house next week. You have your reputation. This project was my last chance. She looked up at him, her mascara running, her face blotchy and ruinous. She looked pathetic. She looked nothing like the goddess he had worshipped. Please, she begged, sliding the loan document toward him. If you are him, if there is any part of the man who loved me left in there, sign it, save me. I can't survive this alone. Ethan looked at the document. He looked at the line where Evie Blackwood was supposed to sign. He picked up the heavy, expensive fountain pen. Clara held her breath, hope flaring in her eyes. Ethan uncapped the pen. He lowered it to the paper. The man who loved you was a builder, Clara, Ethan said softly. He believed in fixing things. He pressed the nib to the paper. But I am not him. With a sudden, violent motion, Ethan drove the pen through the paper, tearing the signature line in half and stabbing the nib deep into the wood of the table. Ink bled out like black blood, staining the document and the mahogany. Clara screamed. Ethan let go of the pen. It stood upright, quivering, pinning her salvation to the table like a dead insect. I am the demolition crew, he said. He turned and walked toward the door. Ethan! No, Ethan, come back! Clara shrieked, scrambling up, knocking her chair over. He didn't stop. He walked out of the boardroom past the terrified receptionist and into the elevator. As the doors closed, he saw Clara running down the hallway, reaching for him, but he was already gone. 72 hours later, the headlines were as predictable as they were savage. Thorne Preservation Trust files for bankruptcy. Historic library project halted indefinitely. Former it couple of architecture world facing fraud investigation. Ethan sat in the first-class lounge at JFK, the newspaper spread open on the table before him. The photo on the front page was unflattering. Julian ducking into a black car, looking bloated and terrified. Clara wasn't in the picture. The article mentioned she had been hospitalized for exhaustion. He took a sip of his espresso. It was bitter, hot, and real. 10 years ago in this same airport, he had felt like he was fleeing a crime scene. He had been hollowed out, a man with no name and no destination, driven only by the agonizing need to escape the pain. Today, he felt light. It wasn't the triumphant lightness of victory. He had expected to feel a surge of joy at seeing their names dragged through the mud, at knowing he was the one who had pulled the pin. But as he looked at the newsprint, he felt nothing. The anger that had fueled him for a decade, the EV Blackwood armor he had welded to his skin, it was all just dead weight now. His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number, but he knew who it was. She had been calling from different lines for 2 days, voicemails pleading, bargaining, apologizing. He didn't decline the call. He didn't answer it. He simply pressed the side button, silencing the vibration, and watched the screen go dark. He opened his contacts list. He scrolled down to Thorne, Clara. He pressed delete. Then he went to his email. He found the folder labeled Vance Recovery, where he had stored every receipt, every legal document, every shred of evidence he had gathered to dismantle them. He selected all. He pressed delete. He emptied the trash. Mr. Blackwood? The lounge attendant stood beside him, smiling politely. Your flight to Tokyo is boarding now. Thank you, Ethan said. He stood up. He picked up his carry-on, a simple leather bag, not the armored briefcase he usually carried. He left the newspaper on the table. He left the cane leaning against the chair. He didn't need it anymore. The limp in his soul was gone. He walked toward the gate, moving through the terminal with a stride that was loose and easy. He passed a massive glass window that looked out over the tarmac and the distant Manhattan skyline. The city was a jagged row of teeth against the gray sky. Somewhere in that concrete jungle, the Vanderhoven Library stood half-finished, a ruin of marble and steel that would stand as a monument to a marriage that never should have happened. It was a scar on the city, yes, but scars were just proof that you had survived. Ethan stopped for a moment. He pulled a small sketchbook from his pocket, not the heavy black one he used for his brutalist designs, but a cheap, spiral-bound pad he had bought at a newsstand. He uncapped a pen. He didn't draw a wall. He didn't draw a bunker. He drew a single sweeping line, a curve, an archway that looked like it was welcoming the light instead of fighting it. It was imperfect. It was organic. It was risky. He smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Goodbye, Evie, he whispered. He closed the book and walked down the jet bridge, leaving the ruins behind him, ready to build something that might actually stand.